In 1834, a set of new poor laws were brought in England. And in 1839, Thomas Carlyle wrote a book called Chartism. So it was written going on 200 years ago, but the ideas in it still hold truths which need to be heard today. He starts out explaining the core reason for why he was writing. He says, "Why are the working classes discontented? What is their condition, economical, moral, in their houses, in their hearts, as it is in reality? And as they figure themselves to be, what do they complain of? What ought they and ought they not to complain of?" So it's a wider issue than simply what's happening right now with this particular bit of legislation. What are today's issues? Often when people are talking, there's this implication that the country is either currently good or bad for certain groups. There's an implication that it can, and indeed that it should be different from how it is. And there's this implication that things are either getting worse or getting better. Carlyle looks to Parliament and answers the question of whether or not Parliament will address all of these issues. Alas, the remote observer knows not the nature of parliaments. How parliaments, extant there for the British nation's sake, find that they are extant withal for their own sake. So he's saying that the Parliament, although it is claiming to be there for the benefit of the nation, is actually there for its own sake. The actual nature of politics is very different from how it's perceived, and indeed it's different from the way that it's portrayed. The reason that the Parliament meets in the UK, or the Houses and the Senate in the US, or any other country, the reason they come and hold their debates is nothing to do with overall improving things in the long term. Each person there has their own set of personal interests, and very few of them seem to have these wider concerns. Getting anything at all done, indeed even just putting out the fires of the day, it seems to take 100% of the debate time. On the whole, parliaments, lumbering along in their deep rut of commonplace, find, as so many of us otherwise do, that the ruts are ankle deep, and the travelling very toilsome in itself, and of the day, the evil in it sufficient. If this is saying that the people in Parliament are blinded entirely to the bigger issues because of the humdrum of the day-to-day, I'm not sure if I agree with that. Certainly, many of them are blinded to the bigger pictures. But the observation doesn't actually rely on mind reading. What are the actions of the Parliament? How does it behave in reality? It does appear that the Parliament is driven more by responding to events rather than actually solving issues. Many people, even those who are highly engaged, have a completely different perception about what's going on. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the people who are spending all their time thinking about politics, they're the most likely to be myopic and have the perspective that the Parliament is actually doing something and is important. What's the purpose of this debating and argumentation? He makes an interesting point here. Could the contending parties get but accurately to discern one another's might and strength to contend, the one would peaceably yield to the other, and to necessity. The contest, in this case, two were over. What's the relevance of talking about battles here? Well, we have politics, so that the battles do not need to happen with violence. Surely everything does ultimately resolve back to physical violence in the end, if necessary. But as long as everyone's prepared to go along with the system, we can avoid it. And what he's saying is that the argumentation that's happening in politics, the debates, is a sign that both sides are fairly equally matched. Nobody would go up to a debate knowing in advance that they were going to lose. So Carlyle looks at one possible answer for how we might try to find the real condition of England. He looks at the suggestion that we could look at statistics, and he's absolutely ruthless in his sarcasm, and he rips this idea apart. Statistics, one may hope, will improve gradually and become good for something. Meanwhile, it is to be feared. A judicious man looks at statistics not to get knowledge, but to save himself from having ignorance foisted upon him. I tend to agree here. I've seen so many cases where statistics and numeric manipulation have been used to prove something that is surprising. It's surprising because it's totally wrong. And I would defend this perspective. There are so many ways that statistics can be misleading. They could be misleading because somebody designed them to be that way, but they could be misleading by accident. Carlyle gives a great example, which he introduces with a caveat. What constitutes the well-being of a man? Many things, of which the wages he gets and the bread that he buys with them are but one preliminary item. So even investigating this number of how big the wages are of the poor, that might lead us to the wrong conclusion. This is a really important issue. Both left and right claim that they have the solution to the material poverty in the world. But in some ways, they've both fallen into the same trap. The real issue is that the lives of people are spiritual rather than material. Not that we shouldn't try to improve people's lives materially, but sometimes there might be overriding concerns. But even if we ignore that problem and just assume that wages are what really matters, the issue isn't simple. Laying up money, he proves that his condition, painful as it may be without and within, is not yet desperate. So what Carlyle's talking about here is, if people can save, then they're not yet at the point of desperation. They're not spending all of their resources on mere survival. They're looking somewhat to the future. He carries on, that he looks forward to a better day coming and is still resolutely steering toward the same. That all the lights and darkness of his lot are united under a blessed radiance of hope. The last, first, nay, one may say the sole blessedness of a man is the habit of saving increased and increasing, or the contrary. Where the present writer has been able to look with his own eyes, it is decreasing, and in many quarters all but disappearing. Statistics science turns up her saving bank accounts and answers, increasing rapidly. Would that one could believe it, but the Donadi's sieve character of such a statistic reticulated documents is too manifest. A few years ago, in regions where thrift, to one's own knowledge, still was, savings banks were not. The labourer lent his money to some farmer of capital, or supposed to be of capital, and has too often lost it, since he bought a cow with it, bought a cottage with it, nay, hid it under his thatch. The savings bank book then exhibited a mere blank and zero. That they swell yearly now, it could be a fact, indicates that what thrift exists does gradually resort more and more to thither rather than elsewhither. What he's saying is, it was previously the case that people would save, but not in the savings banks. So the people who are using statistics look at the numbers in the savings banks going up and say more saving is happening, when what's actually happening is the saving that was occurring elsewhere in thatch and putting it under a mattress or whatever, has moved, and those resources are now stored in a bank. That doesn't mean total saving has increased. It's just gone, as he puts it, thither rather than elsewhither. And it's a really important idea to understand. The fact that you're measuring a number increasing somewhere doesn't necessarily apply what you think it does. In this case, the fact that there are resources being put into banks does not mean that the amount of saving is increasing in total. It's simply that people are saving in a different way to how they used to. Is a similar fallacy happening today? Well, it would certainly be easy to manufacture this kind of fallacy at any time. If you find a new way to measure financial well-being, if it's become the vogue to look in a particular way, all you have to do is slightly modify the system. A little bit of regulation here and a little change of definitions over there, and suddenly the number that you now care about starts to improve compared to what it was before, when presumably you were caring about a different number. The underlying reality is remaining the same, but by manipulating the statistics, you can tell the story and the narrative that you want people to get. And there's an even more frightening point that comes out of this. The idea that savings is a sign that things are not totally desperate. There is a clear logic to that. And if we think about it today, Do people have savings? Well, no, most households are in debt, and the country as a whole has enormous and growing debts. Debts of all kinds are growing. Not only do people have nothing, they have borrowed from their own future resources. Grim indeed. So Carlyle has been criticising the way that the discourse around the poor has been carried out, and he is most cutting with his sarcasm when he introduces the Poor Law Commissioners. These were the people trying to reform the country, to change the way that the poor were treated. And he says, England lay in sick discontent, writhing powerless on its fever bed, dark, nigh desperate, in wastefulness, want, improvidence, and eating care, till, like Hyperion, down the eastern steps, the Poor Law Commissioner arose. Clearly sarcasm. And it does sound like he's writing this book to take down these reformers. In fact, what he's doing, he's introducing the Poor Law Commissioners and saying that their claims are somewhat exaggerated. The way they talk about their own project is as if it's already been a massive success. But nonetheless, Carlyle actually thinks that their project is worthwhile. At least they're trying to do something rather than nothing. And he's more scathing when he talks about the Tories. Let the Tories be minister if they will. Let at least something living in reality be a minister. A rearing horse that will only run backward. He is not a horse one would choose to travel on. Yet of all conceivable horses, the worst is a dead horse. Mounted on a rearing horse, you may back him, spur him, check him, make a little way, even backwards. But seated astride of your dead horse, what chance is there for you in the chapter of possibilities? You sit motionless, hopeless, a spectacle to God and men. In another passage, Carlyle talks about rat catchers. It is a secret known to all rat catchers. Stop up the granary crevices, afflict with continual mewing, alarm, and going off traps. Your chargeable labourers disappear and cease from the establishment. A still briefer method is that of arsenic, perhaps even a milder where otherwise permissible. Rats and paupers can be established. What's Carlyle saying here? He's saying that rat catchers are only required to reduce the number of rats. This can be done simply by moving them elsewhere, and the other approach is to kill them. Perhaps the owner of a house has brought in the rat catcher, specifically saying, I want you to catch the rats, but not kill them. But if the rat catcher can conceal their real methods, they can find an easier path. The equivalence here is the government is simply moving the poor about, either physically or in statistics. Or even worse, maybe there's an implication that the poor are simply being killed to take them off the books. All of this is the result of not being able to properly understand reality. As long as we rely on these faulty statistics, the real condition of the poor will not improve. So Carlyle indeed wanted the condition of the poor to improve, and he actually did want reform of the poor laws. But he did not believe that the poor should be paid without having to work. And this was a very current debate at the time. Carlyle is completely clear in his opinion. For the idle man there is no place in this England of ours. He that will not work and save according to his means, let him go elsewhither. Let him know that for him the law has made no soft provision but a hard and stern one, that by the law of nature, which the law of England would vainly contend against in the long run, he is doomed either to quit these habits or miserably to be extruded from this earth, which is made on principles different from these. He that will not work according to his faculty, let him perish according to his necessity. Ultimately, whether we like it or not, we are living in a universe which requires work. If everybody decided to stop working, then everybody would die. This isn't a decision of society. This is a reality that society is faced with. He goes on, a day is ever struggling forward, A day will arrive, in some approximate degree, when he who has no work to do, by whatever name he be named, will not find it good to show himself in our quarter of the solar system, but may go and look out elsewhere. If there be any idle planet discoverable, let the honest working man rejoice that such law, the first of nature, has been made good to him. But there is another point about work that Carlyle makes, and this one is a more positive one. In Carlyle's mind, work lifts you up. It makes you a king. He that can work is born king of something. He is in communion with nature. He is master of a thing or things, is priest and king of nature so far. He that can work at nothing is but a usurping king. Be his trappings what they may, he is the born slave of all things. To Carlyle, the people being discussed are horribly underestimated. Yet he is a two-footed worker. It is currently reported that there is an immortal soul in him, sent down out of heaven into earth. These people are not animals to be simply cared for. They're powerful human beings with great potential, if it can only be harnessed. For as long as society means that these people, with their great potential, are led to such terrible conditions, Carlyle believes it's not something that can last. It's not a stable system. It may be considered that such an arrangement of things will have to terminate, that it has all just men for its natural enemies, that all just men, of what outward colour soever, in politics or otherwise, will say, this cannot last. Heaven disowns it, earth is against it. Ireland will be burnt into a black, unpeopled field of ashes rather than it should last. And this introduces Carlyle to an interesting digression on the subject of the Irish. The situation at the time in Ireland was extremely dire. There was a great deal of famine and starvation, and many of the Irish were moving to England and elsewhere just to survive. And indeed, there was much hand-wringing about the effects of this immigration into England. Carlyle says unequivocally that the problem was caused by the English. We English pay, even now, the bitter smart of long centuries of injustice to our neighbour island. Injustice, doubt it or not, abounds, or Ireland would not be miserable. The earth is good, bountifully sends food and increase, if man's unwisdom did not intervene and forbid. But Carlyle agrees that it is clear that the effects of a large number of people moving into the country who are prepared to work for lower wages will badly affect the existing poor within the country by making their wages and standard of living reduce. But now, on the whole, it seems to us, English statistics science, with floods of the finest peasantry in the world streaming in on us daily, may fold up her Danaides reticulations on this matter of the working classes and conclude what every man who will take the statistic spectacles off his nose and look may discern in town and country, that the condition of the lower multitudes of English labourers approximates more and more to that of the Irish competing with them in all markets. But what is Carlyle's solution to this issue? He doesn't want to reduce the immigration into England. He suggests that the English take full advantage of the new possibilities of the globalization happening in front of their eyes, and he actually mocks those who are not prepared to take advantage of these new options. Railways are forming in one quarter of the earth, canals in another. Much cartage is wanted somewhere in Europe, Asia, Africa, or America, doubt it not. You will find cartage, go and seek cartage, and good go with you. They, with protrusive upper lip, snort dubiously, signifying that Europe, Asia, Africa, and America lie somewhat out of their beat. That what cartage may be wanted there is not too well known to them. They can find no cartage. Now Carlyle returns to an issue that he previously addressed. What is the real issue among the poor? He says that material well-being is not the key factor. He proposes something else as the primary problem. One thing that cannot be handled is injustice. Nakedness, hunger, distress of all kinds, death itself have been cheerfully suffered when the heart was right. It is the feeling of injustice that is insupportable to all men. Carlyle's view is that it is an offence against man's moral soul, that injustice is far more harmful than an offence just against his body. And he broadens this idea. Essentially, he's making the point that the way people feel about their condition is what makes their actual suffering. Which is true. If we were hoping to improve the condition of people around the world, or even in this country, if we want people to experience a better life, half of the problem is their actual experiences, but perhaps the more important half is their attitudes. And this has interesting historic and geopolitical implications. The Romans, having conquered the world, held it conquered because they could best govern the world. The mass of men found it no wise pressing to revolt. Their fancy might be afflicted more or less, but in their solid interests, they were better off than before. So according to Carlyle, the fact that an empire is able to exist is a sign of tacit consent from the people. They realize that being part of a new empire brings advantages. This will be a very unpopular opinion these days, from all sides. It implies that the people around you are in favour of what is currently happening. How can this be true? Surely empires are held together through force. Well, force only goes so far. In fact, an expanding empire, by definition, will be spreading its force thinner as it expands, so it will eventually reach a point where forces are being spread too thin. But if force isn't needed because people are becoming naturalized, the empire can continue to expand. Our grand question as to the condition of these working men would be, is it just? And first of all, what belief have they themselves formed about the justice of it? The words they promulgate are a notable way of answer. Their actions, still more notable. Chartism with its pikes, Swing with his tinderbox, speak a most loud though inarticulate language. The protests happening at the time of Carlyle were, in his mind, an answer to the condition of the poor. Things were perceived as unjust, and therefore something had to be done. Chartism was the name for one particular movement which tried to address this issue. Carlyle actually, throughout the book, uses many names for this essential push for improvement in the lives of the poor, which he says has many names. Is he in favour of this desire, of this push for improvement? Well, on the one hand, he agrees that humans are not inherently deserving of anything. We all act badly, and in some ways what we all actually deserve is punishment. But on the other hand, there is a way in which there is a natural and good heart in the desire for justice. And in some ways, whether or not it's good, it will happen. All men are justified in demanding and searching for their rights. Moreover, justified or not, they will do it. By Chartisms, radicalisms, French revolutions, or whatsoever method they have, rights surely are right. On the other hand, this other saying is also true. Use every man according to his rights, and who shall escape whipping? These two things we say are both true, and both are essential to make up the whole truth. So in his sympathy for the poor and downtrodden, you might be starting to get the idea that Carlyle will be held up today as a great progressive. However, he fundamentally believed that the poor would always exist. And moreover, he believed that it was necessary for the upper class to guide them. He saw the world as dividing in some ways into those who were toiling with their hands and those above them who were toiling with their minds, guiding them. And it was in the interest of both that both of them work. Surely, of all rights of man, this right of the ignorant man to be guided by the wiser, to be gently or forcibly held in the true course by him, is the indisputablest. Nature herself ordains it from the first. Society struggles towards perfection by enforcing and accompanying it more and more. If freedom have any meaning, it means the enjoyment of this right, wherein all other rights are to be enjoyed. It is a sacred right and duty on both sides, and the summary of all social duties whatsoever between the two. Why does one toil with his hands, if not the other be to toil still more unweariedly with head and heart? The brawny craftsman finds it no child's play to mould his unpliant rugged masses, neither is the guidance of men a dilettantism. If it isn't only material concerns that matter to the individual, what else could it be that matters? Carlyle puts forward a powerful case for why he believes that there is something weak about the desire for money. I, without parchment at all, with a purse oftenest in the flaccid state, imponderous, which will not fling against the wind, have quite other property than that. I have the miraculous breath of life in me, breathed into my nostrils, Almighty God. I have affections, thought, a God-given capability to be and do. Rights, therefore, the right, for instance, to thy love if I love thee, and to thy guidance if I obey thee. And Carlyle makes another point on the subject. Not only is it the case that material concerns are secondary, he believes that societies which prioritize the material concerns will even lose their wealth. On the whole, we will advise society not to talk at all about what she exists for, but rather with her whole industry to exist and try how she can from existing. That is her best plan. She may depend upon it. If she ever by cruel chance did come to exist only for the protection of breacher's pocket property, she would lose very soon the gift of protecting even that, and find her career in our lowest world on the point of terminating. Carlyle is known for his fascinating historiography. He has a very idiosyncratic perspective on the way that we should think about history. And the more I think about it, the more I think his perspective has strong merit. A good example from this book is his comment about causation in history. Rather than asking what is the cause of a certain event, Carlyle talks about the inverse of this. A person or thing or movement generates its own existence, and the only interaction is when something is prevented from being or doing. Why does that hyssop grow there in the chink of the wall? Because the whole universe, sufficiently occupied otherwise, could not hitherto prevent it from growing. It has the might and the right. By the same great law do Roman empires establish themselves. I've only really scratched the surface of this book. I've recorded the whole thing, so you can go and listen to it. I'll put a link in the description. Fun thing to listen out for. See if you can spot the Hamlet quotes that are dotted throughout the book.